My name is Dr. Don Lindhorst, Director of the School of Social Work at St. Louis University and Interim Dean of the College for Public Health and Social Justice. I'd like to welcome you to the School of Social Work's annual Social Justice Night with this year's event titled Ferguson 1 Year Out. Tonight's program is sponsored by the school's Doerr Center for Social Justice Education and Research, an endowed center made possible by the generous gifts of Emmett J. and Mary Martha Doerr and many others. We're very excited to announce that the center will be celebrating its 20th anniversary next year, and plans for a celebration are underway, and we'll certainly be releasing details of that over the months to come. This evening's keynote speaker is Reverend Starsky Wilson. In 2014, Missouri Governor Jay Nixon appointed Reverend Wilson to co-chair the Ferguson Commission to study the underlying conditions and make policy recommendations to help the region progress through issues exposed by the death of Michael Brown Jr. The Ferguson Commission released its report last week. Reverend Wilson will discuss the report's findings and their implications. Reverend Starsky Wilson.
Good evening. It is indeed a pleasure and an honor to be here with you all on tonight. It is a bit of a daunting task. Someone asked me, I speak every Sunday at our church, which is not very far from here. The young lady who met me at the garage to make sure that I made it to the appropriate location asked me, "Are you nervous?" I said, "Not until you just asked me that question." Was I nervous? But perhaps I should be. Looking at all of you, I see warm smiles and faces, but I see a lot of them, so I am indeed nervous. I want to thank Dr. Lindhorst for this opportunity to come and to share with each of you from our own experience, the experience that we've engaged over the course of the last really 10 months to 13 months. So I'll share a bit from the experience of the commission, but then also about what we believe the implications are for our nation, for our region. I'd like to do a bit of a crowd check first, so that it might help me in my timing, if you would. How many people here have read, primarily because someone made you do it for credit, have read the commission's report at forwardthroughferguson.org? Okay, all right. No embarrassment, no test. It's just, okay. And your professors were not looking at you if you were supposed to have already read it. Actually, they were. But so we'll spend some time today lining out the report itself, but then I want to spend more time talking about the implications if that's okay with you. Is that all right? All right. I'll also note, as he noted, I am a pastor of St. John's Church, the beloved community that is predominantly African-American church, although it's in a Protestant mainline denomination. I say that to let you know that culturally, I do not find it offensive if you speak back to me while I'm speaking. It actually helps me to keep my time. So when I say, is that okay? I actually mean, you can say, okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. On November 18th, Governor Jay Nixon commissioned at the Missouri History Museum a group of folks, not a blue ribbon commission, clearly. I would not have made it. Not a group of academics only, although there was at least one, and not a group of political pundits or retired executives of various political stripes, but rather a group of citizens to come together to be commissioned to work on, study, and to consider the issues that were raised by the killing of Michael Brown on August 9, 2014, to develop a set of policy recommendations that would guide the community in how it should move forward to become a stronger, fairer, and more inclusive St. Louis region. Not to focus on one small hamlet, a city, a suburb, in the city of St. Louis, but rather to consider regional priorities, to consider policies that may be enacted at various levels, whether they be state or local, to advance equity in the St. Louis metropolitan region. In that report, in that executive order that called for the report, we were advised to work in actually 4 very critical areas and then a long list of social disparities. Those dedicated areas were citizen law enforcement relations, municipal courts, municipal governance, and racial and ethnic relations. Then along with that was a list of 9 social disparities that were actually listed, laid out, that we had to consider. Disparities in economics, education, transportation, housing, community stability, family stability, all listed in this broad health, all listed in this broad list. And we were to make some sense of that work. The dates are important here. On November 18th, the commission gathered and received its official order, brought into existence by Executive Order 1415. On November 24th, the No True Bill was announced by our St. Louis County prosecutor. And the streets of our community dramatically changed. Some say on that night buildings were on fire. I drove around that night. I left a church service, gathered there with the St. Louis Metropolitan Clergy Coalition, where folks were gathered together to receive word and to pray. And then I went to the streets with actually a professor from St. Louis University who had studied these issues. He and I drove around on the streets of South Florissant, got out. We experienced the wafting of tear gas there. We tried to make our way to West Florissant, couldn't make it. All we saw was burned out buildings. We saw our colleagues, some of our friends, people we have come to know and love by being on the streets there together at night, be harmed. Saw a local clergyman pass out from the experience of the gases. Carried him to safety and have folks who had been trained as medics, although they were not such in their daily lives, to care for him in the middle of the street. And then on December 1st, after that kind of tragedy and that kind of difficulty in our community, we held the first meeting of the Ferguson Commission in the Ferguson Community Center. The meeting lasted 6.5 hours. We thought it appropriate to tell the community something about ourselves. We hadn't put ourselves on a ballot. We hadn't given people an opportunity to kick the tires. The community didn't want to hear, they wanted to speak. After the challenges and the pain that they had experienced ever since August 9th, from groups of young people, some who had been organizing for an increase in the minimum wage in the fast food campaign, some who were students on various university campuses, and some who were dejected and had gotten used to the kind of police treatment that they saw of Michael Brown that day, all gathered around Mike's body, looked up at one another and decided that they wouldn't go inside until somebody gave them some answers. And after all of that protracted tragedy, on December 1st, we gathered together to convene a conversation about policy recommendations, about how we would move forward as a community to be stronger, fairer, and more inclusive. That was our charge, and it's important first to understand the charge. And the people brought together to do that were a great group of people. I really like these folks. I don't agree with everybody, but I really like this group because it represented our community broadly. Were there people missing? Yes. First of all, there were too many men on the commission. I don't say that just having been informed by the process and, would have liked the perspective of more women engaged in the process, the nuance, the sophistication. But I say that just to say our region is not as masculine as the commission was. That was one of its deficiencies. It did not represent voices from places like the arts community. It did not represent voices from the Hispanic community or our growing Bosnian population. But it did, more than others, represent the people. And so we'll talk a little bit about the work and the report. Over the course of time, we were committed to provide a report with these recommendations, but we took as our charge as well the responsibility to guide the community through a broad, transparent, and open process of civic engagement that could lead to other kinds of actions and that affirmed all voices. And so that's what we did, and this is part of what we came up with. In the report, which has been noted already, counts 189 pages. It can be found at forwardthroughferguson.org. You find a commitment in these 4 broad categories. Racial equity, which is an overarching theme of the report. We note that in order to be a stronger community, we must be a more equitable community. Talk a little bit about definitions in a moment. It also speaks to justice for all. Under this category, we speak to and consider issues both in the courts, also in policing, and broadly how we order those things structurally. We talk about youth at the center, implications for caring for the entire child, with the recognition that this nation has never put together a system to care for child well-being or to advance it. It has only put together a system to educate children, primarily using childhood as a launching pad and a preparation space for adulthood, not affirming childhood as a space of life in and of itself. And we also considered, finally, opportunities to thrive. Here we talked about economic equity issues, things like the implications of health, the access to health care, housing, transportation, and the like on opportunities for people to thrive. So in these various areas, here you see racial equity spoken of. Here you find Amari and his daughter. Amari's story is on the website. We encourage you to go there to talk about the impact of eliminating racial disparities in our region. One of the things we note, and you'll see it in the report, is that disparity costs. It costs. For some members of our region, it cost them years of their lives. We found when we looked at reports that were already in existence, like the For the Sake of All report, that if you live in 63105, you live 18 years longer than if you live in 63106. That's 10 miles away from one another. It gets even worse. If you live in Wildwood, you live 50 years longer than if you live in Kinloch. Much of that has to do with your access to health care. Some of that has to do with your capacity to care for chronic diseases. Some of it has to do with the health and the order of your neighborhoods, and some of it has to do with the fact that you also earn more depending on where you live. 63106, you earn 3 times if you live, 63105, you earn 3 times what you earn if you live in 63106. And so when we talk about this, it costs years, days, weeks of folks' lives, but it also costs money. The University of Missouri-St. Louis Public Policy Research Center suggests that in the year 2012, our racial inequities in our region cost us $14 billion in gross domestic product. It costs lives. It costs lives. It costs money. So what we call for in this area, most significantly, again, we're making policy recommendations, is to apply a racial equity framework to all of our policy discussions. What does that mean? It means before you pass a piece of legislation, before you pass a regulation, before you pass an ordinance, you ask the question with disaggregated data, who does this benefit and who does this disadvantage? And that should be as common as a fiscal note. If you can't pass a piece of legislation without talking about how much it costs the state, then you shouldn't be able to pass a piece of legislation without talking about what black folks, what Hispanic folks it's going to kill. And yes, lives are on the line. And so we call for the application of this framework to ask the question, who does this advantage? Who does this harm? What differentiated impact does this have on different racial groups? The second thing we ask for here is we ask for the creation of a 25-year managed fund to support racial equity infrastructure. What do I mean? One of the things that we found, I'm not a St. Louisan originally. I've been to enough Cardinals games that I think I'm one now, officially. I'm an acculturated St. Louisan. I came here in 2000. In 2000, there was a robust conversation about diversity in our region. There was a significant conversation about regional planning because of St. Louis 2004, and there was significant infrastructure in organizations like NCCJ and the Diversity Awareness Partnership and the YWCA, advancing racial equity and holding corporations both accountable and equipping them to do the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion within those companies. And over the course of the last 15 years, we've seen a significant erosion in that infrastructure. And we've seen a regression of commitments to these issues by the corporations, by some of our large institutions, and quite frankly, in our public dialogue as well. So we call for, as informed by some folks who have helped us with this from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. They note in their national racial equity initiative called America's Healing that they don't go in to make investments in a community unless they make a 25-year commitment, because it takes a generation to see the kind of changes at scale that we desire. So population level change in these disparities actually requires a commitment of decades. And so thus the 25-year managed fund. The suggestion is that this should be placed in a space where investments can be made from the community to build an infrastructure to continue to sustain these issues and conversations. and to make them more than conversations, but actually apply and implement policy. We also call for an engagement of the faith community. We kept using this word kept coming up, reconciliation. Now, I'm slow to throw words around. I'm a preacher. Dr. Gardner Taylor, Dean of all preachers, says that we must understand that all we have is the economy of words, and we cannot use them wrongly. Reconciliation requires equity. It is not getting along. It is not accommodation. It is not quiet. It is not going back to normal. And in order to get to equity, which is a theological term, then we need to theologize in some ways. We need to place a broader context, at least a transcendent context in our public dialogue, and understand that when we make policy, which are the rules by which we decide we're going to be community together, we are stating values, and that dialogue should be informed by something greater than a grounded perspective in who I am and who I believe you are. And so we actually do call on faith leaders to engage in public policy discussions. For the record, this wasn't my idea, just so you know. In the second major area, we talk about justice for all. Here we recognize that this requires a commitment and honest review of our current systems, thoughtfulness about consolidation, because we have so many police systems, so many courts in our region. In St. Louis County, we have 91 municipalities. We've got some 80 courts and 60 police departments. So as we talk about that, and some of them are very small, some of them are very large. Some of them have the resources to do the kind of work that we're called to do in a region like this, and some of them do not. It is telling to note that the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, which, by the way, I would suggest has its issues. So I tell people all the time, I'm not doing commercials for the St. Louis PD, okay? Because our story interweaves, right? So we're informed by all our experiences, right? So I can point out data and still have my story. Can I say that? So it's important that one of the most well-resourced police departments in our community has had 2 classes in a row that have been half African American in their academy. And when you talk to police, you note, and I'm not trying to offend anybody, but the better police officers at the larger departments who have the better resources, they're more diverse, they have more capacity for training, they've already committed to some of the calls to action we have made around police training and increasing such voluntarily because they've got the resources and they're more diverse forces. Now they still have their issues. Starsky Wilson was tear gassed at the corner of Grand and Arsenal, not in St. Louis County. And he still got their issues. So minority recruitment does not resolve the issue. But getting to some consolidation where you have the capacity to actually train people effectively and appropriately is a standard that we need to hold for our community, particularly when we know that we can differentiate between officers throughout the state for counties of our size. So this is part of what we call for in this space. Police reform. We actually have a state law on the books in Missouri, so you should be embarrassed by this if you live in Missouri. So this is the public shame part, okay? Public shame. Tennessee versus Garner is a U.S. Supreme Court case that suggests that the use of force statute that we have in our state has been out of whack for years. That our actual law on the books is insufficient and out of line with Supreme Court decisions right now. And we couldn't even get in the last legislative session the General Assembly to pass a piece of legislation to come into agreement with what the U.S. Supreme Court already said. If you're in Missouri, you should be embarrassed. These people represent you. Thank you. But it also increases training and use of force. So one of the things we call for in April, we made a call in April to increase training in the areas of use of force, anti-bias policing, and officer wellness. We're pleased that the governor responded to that call already in August. He appointed people to the Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission, which reports to the Department of Public Safety, in order to make those changes as aligned with what we've already called for. On December 1st, by December 1st, they should report back to you what changes, what rules they have already made in order to increase. We have called for an increase in continuing education from the 43 hours that are required to over 120 hours. Now, we don't know if they'll make it to 120, but if they make it to 75, I'm clapping. So we call for additional training in these areas. We also call for oversight and civilian review. It is important to note, we call for this for police departments at the city level as well as the county level. So there are details on this in the plan, but it's important to note the environment. When people talk about the impact that commissions have, I like to talk about the impact that it has already had. So if you ask Jamala Rogers, one of the co-chairs of the Coalition Against Police Crimes and Repression, and one of the founders of the Organization for Black Struggle, how long have you been working for civilian oversight in the city of St. Louis? She'll tell you 30 years. And it was one in the last year. Because there's been sustained public dialogue and accountability about these conversations where we've been able to join voices, not just from the grassroots, but also from the grass tops to say this is something we've got to do something about. And the embarrassment of that brother over there and the eyes of the nation actually being on this region saying, what are you going to do something, had something to do with this getting passed in the last year. But this kitchen table called a commission did as well. And so this is something that can be expanded. Making sure that we have real civilian oversight with real subpoena power, with capacity to investigate is one of the things that we've called for. Also connected to this area, we've asked for reform in how police violence or police brutality incidents are investigated. First and foremost, there should be independent prosecution from the Attorney General's office. There should be independent investigation from the Missouri Highway Patrol, not just every officer, officers investigating their own issues. I tell people, anybody here watch Law and Order? My wife loves Law and Order. She watches Law and Order you can always find a marathon of Law and Order. One of the most powerful things about Law and Order, first of all, they resolve everything in 52 minutes. Like, I don't understand how you do that in 52 minutes. But one of the most powerful images of Law and Order, as it opens and as it closes, you see a picture of police and prosecutors walking off together into the sunset. It looks like the Justice League, right? You can see the capes going off. This is the challenge. What we're currently doing in our current system is we're asking those prosecutors who walk off at the end of the episode every time in the marathon with the same police who walk off with them with their capes flapping in the wind to investigate one another. That's our current system. And so what we suggest is you're not going to get impartial. Quite frankly, you'll at least get a perception of a conflict of interest in the public, as long as you got to investigate somebody you've been working with in every episode on the marathon. In the area of court reform, we ask for sentencing reform, that we should consider, we should apply, we should use the capacity for alternative sentencing, that people should not go to jail. This is part of our early vision. We articulated at 100 days. People should not go to jail for tickets because they don't have money. There's nothing to do with public safety tied up in that. And so what we call for is the use of community service, other alternative means to pay, access to the courts, education on the constitutional rights of those who find themselves in courts, fully accessed. When I talk about young people, I'm pretty critical about this. It is unfortunate that we have courts in this region right now, after all of and please, I'm just going to say this very clearly. Do not take the removal of back warrants as reform. Those are actions that have been taken over the course of the last month to get into compliance because of the implementation of Senate Bill 5. So those are people taking warrants off the books so that they don't have to give up their courts right now, so that they don't have to give up revenue to their school districts right now. That's not reform. What we call for is consolidation of these courts. What we call for is revising things like this. If you're a young person who finds yourself in some of our municipal courts, if you come with your parents on some day, you can't get into court with your parents if they got a court date. But if you got one of your own, we'll welcome you in without representation. Access to the courts is part of it. Constitutional rights is part of it. We call for no juvenile to ever find themselves in court without representation. And then it's care for conflict of interest. Part of this gets to structural change as well. We ask for consolidation of the courts. We ask for consolidation, the consideration of consolidation of police departments as well. Senate Bill 5, which has been passed already, it is a historic reform bill for our municipal courts. One of the things that's in it that people don't think about, they're talking about just the cap on revenue. Yes, that's critically important. It keeps our courts from being ATMs pointed directly at young black and poor people in the county. And I say that very clearly based upon data. We've seen a 53% increase in poverty in St. Louis County over the course between 2000 and 2013. It is a trend of the suburbanization of poverty that the Brookings Institution has noted across the country. But when we talk about reforming them, we also recognize that we've got to get to a point where there's not the profit motive embedded within the system, so you actually have to structurally reform. And so part of what we call for when we talk about the consequences of court fragmentation is the reality that the courts themselves, because they are governed by and tied directly to some municipal governance, you can see things happen. It actually is not foreign to see what we saw in the Department of Justice report in Ferguson. The documentation of a city manager the documentation of a city manager contacting the chief of police, encouraging him to write more tickets so that we can fill a hole in the budget. And so we recognize that there's a challenge both in this profit motive but also in oversight. If you look across the state, although we have these 80 courts under one supervising judge, the closest we come anywhere else in the state has 22 courts under one supervising judge. The recognition here is that with 80 courts, there is no oversight, no matter how you count it on an org chart. As we consider youth at the center, recognizing young people, apologies to St. Louis University for the color of this gentleman's robe. We call for here, some folks know that robe, it works really well on a campus on Skinker, I don't know why. Within this priority, we're thoughtful about the growth and hunger among young people, begin using schools as centers of health, think about school-based health clinics and the opportunity for that, but also there's a significant chunk and section here on reforming school discipline. We recognize that our region leads the nation and the disparity between particularly black boys receiving out-of-school suspension. So we call here for moratoriums on out-of-school suspensions, particularly for students from between kindergarten and third grade, because we also know that that ends up tracking students all the way through to these kinds of encounters that they find with police. We also call for infrastructure reform, investing in early childhood education, educational innovation, and fixing school accreditation, quite frankly. We're thoughtful about that. There was a good group of educators who are doing this work and considering this for us. As we consider the investments in early childhood education, we're talking structurally, but we're also talking about things like child development accounts, things that can make a generational impact. In wonderful states, great progressive states like Maine and, I don't know, Oklahoma, every child born in the state has a child development account that they can begin to preserve for college servings open in their name. That account has a few different things we found with study over time. Students who have that account, their parents are more engaged in their education. They tend to make better grades. They tend to actually track to better job outcomes, economic stability outcomes, and long term we know that that's connected to their health care. So you actually extend life by making, in some cases, in some states, a $50 investment at birth. There's plenty of energy around this now. We have 529s in our region, but it's not something that's accessible for all children. So one of the things we call for is to make this accessible for all children. And quite frankly, my piece on this, we asked for some other things. These are just the priority recommendations. That we've got to put structures and networks in place to advance children's interests. The reality is this. The people who are most impacted by public policy don't have a voice in it because they don't get a vote. They don't have lobbyists. So the question is, who's going to consider them? We did so in our process, as a process point. One of the things we used to vet what makes it to the 44 priority recommendations from the 189. And we said, which ones can we identify have an impact through a racial equity lens, through a health equity lens, which ones have a generational impact, and which ones can we tie directly to data already in the field. So as we talk about this, the generational consideration comes up again. The final area that we looked at was opportunities to thrive. Now, somebody wanted to ask me the question, somebody asked in the hall, were there areas that got really hard and things you didn't agree on? Yes. We were on this campus in an all-day meeting of the Economic Inequity and Opportunity Work Group, and we had the most debate about the minimum wage. And on a split vote out of that work group, we passed an increase to the minimum wage that had more modifiers and qualifiers to it. It was like 3 paragraphs. Well, you increase it to this, if that, and if this, and if the sky turns blue on that day and turns red on the next, then you can tie it to an indicator and increase it. Thank you very much. And the commission went and passed the commission. It didn't pass unanimously either. But we did call for an increase of the minimum wage to $15 an hour in the state of Missouri. This is another area where we recognize that we were in an ongoing dialogue at the regional level as well. So I gave testimony, as did some other commissioners. I think Rasheen Aldridge did as well. Is that you back there, Rasheen? That's him at the door. Gave testimony as well before the St. Louis Board of Aldermen to increase the minimum wage. We saw that pass in Kansas City. We saw it pass in the city of St. Louis on the last day that it could pass in order to make it through what we knew was going to happen, what we thought may happen in the veto session. You also see work here around the areas of predatory lending. We recognize this is one of the most unbanked communities in the nation, and so we thought it appropriate to address that. And then you hear these child development accounts I spoke of before, but also family development accounts. And we called for the expansion of Medicaid. We recognize that this is something that's been going on. We know that this is an ongoing discussion. We didn't believe that everything in this report was going to be new, but we knew that this was tied to economic outcomes and equity in our region, and so we call for that as well. The final note I'll make here is about transportation. One of the things we recognize is that our region has a widely diffuse workforce. We've got lots of jobs, they just happen to be spread out. That when we look at the study from Harvard University, Ross Chetty notes that we have one of the most diffuse workforces of the top 50 metropolitan areas in the nation. What we were critical to do in this conversation is let's have a conversation about economics, but let's talk about economic mobility, not economic development. Economic mobility, the capacity of people to move from one social class, economic class to the next within the next generation. Right? That's what the myth of the American dream is about, really. So let's talk about that. Let's use indicators related to that, right? Let's talk about inputs for that. So building assets is required for that, but getting a job is also required for that. And I'll just say this publicly right now, a 4, 5, or 6 week job training program that is not tied to a job is not going to resolve the issues that we find in our urban communities. We can brand it, we can repackage it, we can keep selling it to corporate interests who want a photo op and a big check all we want to. That is not going to resolve these issues. Particularly, and I'll go further here, I know they're taping this with somebody. When you recognize that a whole group of people have been disenfranchised and you aim your program at half of them, there's absolutely no way you're going to transform a community, and maybe you don't even plan on it. So what do you actually have to do? You actually have to help people build assets. Child development accounts, family development accounts, IDAs do that. You actually have to set a transit system that lets them get to the jobs. And so part of our challenge here is the fragmentation of the region, but also the fact that every time we want to expand our light rail system to places where actual jobs are, people stand up with signs and say, "Not in my backyard." And that's directly tied to race. How do we know? Because those same communities stand up when we try to send little black kids there and say, "We don't want you here." And so part of the economic inequity issue here is that we don't have a well-developed transit and transportation policy that gets people to the jobs, and we don't have the capacity to help people build assets once they get there. And that's not a program issue. Spend some time. Just look, my church is it's 2 miles up the street, but it's in another world. Walk around the neighborhood a little bit like I did before I took the call to the church and ask people, They'll tell you about programs. They'll tell you how many job training programs they've been through. Tell you, please stop disrespecting me with your new program that's going to leave when your funding goes away. They don't need programs. They need structural change and policy in order to give them real opportunity. So part of what we lay out here, I've used most of my time. This is really what we've done through the process. We've laid out a report. We've engaged the community in the process. And part of what it's about now is a community leadership and community ownership long term. So those, folks have been asking me the question. I've done it, on radio and TV. Will this be a report that sits on a shelf? Well, for the record, this thing that's printed is not the report. It's a supplement to the report. The report is digital, so if you can figure out a way to put that on the shelf, then let me know. Said my friend Evan said, well, will it just be a report that floats in the cloud? That's my dude. I like Evan. Good SLU grad. And I say that's a valid question. For everyone across the globe, minus the 2.8 million people who live in the St. Louis region. If you're asking, is this report going to sit on the shelf, then you're saying one of two things. Number one, the status quo is fine with me. I know it costs us $14 billion a year. I know it's costing people years on their life, but that's fine with me. I have no agency. I refuse to accept agency. It's fine with me. If you're one of those 2.8 million people and you're asking that question, you're either saying that or you're saying that I am so very apathetic or lazy or uncommitted that I refuse to do anything about it. I have agency, but I won't use it. Either way, that's pretty privileged of you, no matter what you look like. So what it's going to take is us to consider some things differently. Consider policy over program. Consider shifts in our infrastructure. And to make the investments align with the policies and the infrastructure that we need. That's how we'll get to change. I don't want to talk about all that. This is what I asked you to do. In the time they gave me, I got about 10 more minutes. Read the report. The application of the racial equity lens is something you can do in whatever institution or organization you're in. Look around at your board, your decision makers, your budget, your entity, and ask, does it look like the community in which you live? Think about the things that match for you. I tell people all the time, there are 189 recommendations in here. The commission wasn't as brilliant as to agree with everything I said. So I have disagreements with things that are in the report. I assume in a group this large, you will too. But there are 3 things in this report. 3 things that will get you up in the morning. 3 things that will cause you great passion. 3 things that will change your children's lives. Don't work on 189, work on your 3. If you work on your 3, we'll build a better nation. We'll build a better region for our children. Communicate and share this. This platform was built to be clickable, shareable, all of this kind of stuff. That's why it's digital. So when you read something in the report and it connects with some conversation you were having over lunch, you can share it with somebody and send them a link and say, this is what I was talking about. Or when you read something that you just don't believe, say, I don't know about this. And share that too. Share with people, with others. Continue to create opportunities to talk about the report. Part of the work we're going to be doing over the course of the next few months is to find a successor entity, someone who can keep up evaluation, monitoring, communications about this report. I got to go back to work. But the community needs to get to work. So we'll find an entity to keep that up in a structural way, in a sustained way, and to set new tables. In some of these places, there are already people working. The consideration of the policy recommendations that youth at the center are already being vetted by Ready by 21, a table that's convened around youth issues from cradle to career, staffed by the United Way, a multi-sector table that's already going on. But there needs to be work in this justice for all area. I'm pleased to say that over the course of the last month, I've sat around a table with community organizers and advocates from some 9 different local organizations. Before the report came out, they assessed all 189, and they said these are the 5 that we really need critical accountability on. These are the 5 that line up with our institutional and organizational agendas, and these are the 5 that we want to critically organize accountability around. And so I'm glad that on November 1st, this is an announcement. Y'all are the first ones to know this. On November 1st, in the Wool Ballroom, we're going to pack it out. They said the capacity is 1,600 people, John. We're going to see if we can push some people into the hallway. Those organizations will convene a public meeting to identify clearly issues that they want to continue to run campaigns around, and they want to ask public officials to come and stand and make their own commitments to moving these recommendations. That's the kind of work that it's going to take to make this happen. That's the kind of movement that can transform our community. And that's quite frankly what you're being invited to. So there are a lot of implications for the nation. I'll do this very quickly. First implication for the process. I've only got 6 more minutes. That's all I'm going to use. First implication for the process. The process was wide open. 2,000 people committed more than 20,000 volunteer hours with 100 dedicated professionals and experts, and it all happened in the public space. It's the people's report because it was paid for by the people. A lot of people were upset about that, but this is different. Usually commissions work. I'll give you an example. The President's Task Force, 21st Century Task Force, started its work. It was announced on December 1st. That's when we had our first meeting. You remember that because you were paying attention in the beginning. I saw you writing it down. Thank you. We began on December 1st. They reported back at the end of March. That's usually how commissions work. They have about 4 months to do their work, to come back with stuff that people already know. They can't broadly publicly engage, and they don't have the resources to actually get anything done. Ask Lindsay Lupo. She wrote a book about this called Flat Catchers. I read it from cover to cover. It's about 100 years of riot commission politics in America. Because what it's really about in those cases is not exactly getting stuff done, but rather getting the conversation over with. What we've done is sustain a conversation for 10 months. St. Louis used to have a 6-week rule. It's mostly just for black people. Black people get mad about something 6 weeks later. If you can sustain 6 weeks, you'll move on to something else. That's how the black community has been managed in St. Louis for years. We sustained a conversation for 10 months. We kept the issues critical, and we kept them centered in the public debate till we had to come up with some policy solutions. We didn't get confused or distracted by the big check presentations because that didn't mean structural change. And so this is a project in inclusive democracy, to have people actually support, engage, and come up with their own solutions and put them forth, and then hold elected officials accountable rather than have people go behind closed doors and come up with solutions for our region. That's one of the significant impacts. We're at a critical point. We've got to ask ourselves the question on this project, because this is, I say these issues are, we have found ourselves having this conversation in the heart of America, but the reality is these issues, particularly the ones of police violence, are connected with the history of America. So the challenge is, in our history, are we really going to be about inclusive democracy? Do we want the majority of people to have voice in a process and a project and actually determine how they're going to live their lives together? And when we run down the list, here recently, we're not exactly sure that we want that. Ask the people of Detroit about an emergency manager who wasn't elected, but who has control over how their city is run. Ask the people of Katrina, who saw public works militarized and centralized after that disaster. Ask anybody who lives in a school district that's not accredited and has an appointed school board whether inclusive democracy is working for them. There are some public policy implications for inclusive democracy. As we talk about this, we must consider those things. We must also consider our philanthropic investments. In our region, we invest in services, not systems. We invest in programs, not policy. We're a very generous region. We're highly regarded in our United Ways and the like, but we don't have not one community organizing or advocacy organization in this community that has a full-time development officer or fundraiser, not one that has a budget over $300,000, and that's because we like to count heads for kids in a program, but we don't like to invest in structurally changing the outcomes for those children. So it has implications for our philanthropic investments, has implications for whether we are really engaged in desire, a project, and inclusive democracy. Then it has implications on how we understand ourselves in the world and what it's going to require ultimately. Do we understand ourselves as the kind of nation of folks that are engaged in democracy who actually believe in the project of American progress and make that possible for people? Because those young people who got together on August 9th recognize something else. They recognize that they're the first generation. Oh, I'm sorry. You are the first generation of Americans who won't do as well as your parents. So the value of progress is at the core of the idea of the American dream that's tied up with inclusive democracy is critically in question. And if that's acceptable, that's cool, you came, you got the credit. If not, then you're called to resistance, response to get to reconciliation. Resistance looks like grassroots mobilization. We have seen a response to grassroots mobilization of militarized policing, calls for states of emergency, and a ramping up. Just this week, $1.8 million given from the federal government to the St. Louis Police Department for more officers. That's our response. What does reconciliation look like? Reconciliation moves along a path from the opportunity we talked about in the 50s and 60s to the diversity that we've been celebrating, quite frankly, far too long, through the 80s, 90s, and the aughts, to inclusion, where we can look at our public bodies, look at the leadership of our core institutions, and actually see a reflection of the demographics of our nation, of our region, of our state. The first indicator of our success long term will be 10 years from now. If we can look up and see on school boards, see in elective office, see as the heads of major corporations, a reflection of the demographics of our community. The next note of progress from diversity is inclusion. And then 20 years from now, perhaps, we begin to see population level equity. What we've offered in the report is a path. Reconciliation requires equity. Will we get there as a region? I'm a preacher. I deal in hope. I believe we will. I know we can. But as I said when we released the report, it will be tough if we take it seriously. This is a path. It's not the path, it's a path. But to move us from opportunity through diversity toward inclusion for the sake of equity. And then perhaps there can be true, honest, theologically consistent, and integrous reconciliation. God bless you, and I thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Reverend Wilson.